Happy New Year. My name is Kari Sautner. I'm the Chief Learning Officer at the National Constitution Center, and I'm so excited to be in class with you today. So get your questions ready, get your stories ready to share. We're going to have a fun-filled class in about 35 minutes, and we're going to dive into the civil rights movement and looking closely at the 1900s. Focusing probably on the 1950s and 60s the most. But to do this great walkabout of civil rights history in the modern time period, we have our Chief Content Officer, lots of chiefs in here, our Chief Content Officer, Tom Donnelly. Tom, how excited are you for this class today?
Very excited. It's always one of our favorites.
I know, it's so good. So Tom, there's so much we wanted to talk about, and we all know I ask a million questions along with our students. But one of the things that I wanted to kick us off with, and I know you're going to do a good job to unpack this, is sometimes when we're taught about the civil rights time period, we tend to make it one person. This image was on our website, and I absolutely loved it. There was, something about this image where you see multiple people standing in front of Lincoln, and you realize that you have to pull back the layers of that single story of the civil rights time period. Never ever to take anything away from the great, amazing Martin Luther King, but there's so many other people behind it. And when I started to look at this primary source and pull it back a little bit more, I noticed something was crucially missing when talking about the civil rights time period. So students, feel free to put it in the chat. This is not a hard question. I promise it's really easy. Look at this picture, and I want you to answer who's missing from this picture. So when we think about civil rights leaders, and we think around the civil rights time period, who's missing? So I'll give you a minute to answer it in the chat. Yep, MLK is not there, right? Very good. So Jessica, you're right, MLK is not there, which is kind of interesting to show these great leaders together and not show MLK, but also very good, thank you, Danita, no women, and Jeff, very good, there's no women. And that has been the way that the civil rights time period has been taught for years, is so much focus around these amazing men, and they are absolutely amazing men, but the civil rights movement would not have been as impactful without telling the full story and telling the story of all the people that helped it. So what Tom's going to do for us today, he's going to walk us through all that built up to the civil rights period and the changes in the courts and in the law and with the president. But first, he's going to unpack the players, all the different people, and when they worked and how they worked together to make this amazing system of effort to go over the years to make things move and to change the Constitution and to make sure we're living up to our Constitution. Tom, before we dive into all the players on the civil rights time period, could you kind of give us the big idea? Like, what's the big overarching idea we should hold on to when thinking about the fight for freedom through civil rights?
Absolutely, Kari. So, in part, it's that our nation's story begins with the Declaration of Independence and its promise of freedom and equality. But what we know is for far too long, those promises were denied to many Americans, including, importantly, African Americans. And so the story we're going to tell today is about the long civil rights movement. And the things we want to stress are, one, we may think of the civil rights movement as primarily the 1950s and 60s, but it's a movement that's far longer, that stretches all the way back to America's founding. The other is the point that Kari emphasized early on that's so important, which is that this story is not a story of any single person. It's an ensemble cast. It's all about how ordinary Americans work together with movement leaders who eventually work together with those powerful in government like the president, Congress, and the Supreme Court, all to push for reform, all to push for civil rights. And it's a reminder that big constitutional change in America often takes all of those actors acting in unison. In the end, what was the goal? It was to realize the promise of America's creed, that we are all free and equal.
So many players, so much effort, so much work over so much time. And I think that's also really important to remember how much and how many people have to all be pushing together in the same way over such a long period of time to make this kind of change. Seems like something that shouldn't take this long or this hard, but unbelievably is. And just the gratitude that we have for the people who have done this. So let's start with the individual groups, who they were, when they were formed, and who are the key players, so that we can see how they started working together to really bubble up this American change. So we'll start with one many people know today, the NAACP.
For the NAACP, it's founded in 1909. So even there, you could see that's well before the 1950s and 60s. Its charter gives its mission. It's to promote equality of rights and eradicate caste or race prejudice among citizens of the United States. The NAACP fought for that when it came to the vote. So at the ballot box, in schools, at work, all across American society. Its broad goal is there at the end of that quote, which was the quote, complete equality before the law. So it's an inspiring and ambitious mission. The NAACP is founded by some extraordinary people. And so beginning with Ida B. Wells, the first name that you see listed there, she was a courageous journalist, civil rights figure. And as a journalist, she actually studied white violence in the South in the late 1890s and early 1900s. So a lot of what we know about violence against African Americans during that period comes from Ida B. Wells and her courageous journalism. Another key figure is W.E.B. Du Bois, who was one of the most important public intellectuals in American history. He's the first African American to earn a PhD at Harvard. He was the author of a great history of the post-Civil War period known as Black Reconstruction, which put African Americans at the center of the story of pushing for reform during Reconstruction. And so he's a key figure within the NAACP. We also see Mary White Ovington, who was a suffragist, a journalist, also a co-founder of the NAACP. Again, we could see from Wells, Du Bois, and Ovington the importance of people exercising their constitutional rights like the First Amendment. They were key journalists using those rights to advance the message of equality for all. And then finally, we have Moorfield Story, who was a lawyer from Boston and the founding president of the organization from 1909 to 1929.
Awesome. So another group is the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. And so this is the one that a lot of people know about because MLK was a big player in this group. So tell us about SCLC. There's so many acronyms, people on this. Be prepared. I will give you a list at the end.
That's true. Yeah. So the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, it's formed in 1957. Its key principle is nonviolence. So it's nonviolent direct action. That's its key founding principle. The idea there being that if you're going to be met with violence from your opposition, you're going to meet it with nonviolence to really take the moral high ground and to show that it really takes violence and force to enforce oppressive laws like those promoting Jim Crow segregation. There are a ton of key figures within this organization. Curry also already mentioned Dr. King. There's also on the bottom left-hand corner there, you can see Ella Baker, who was such an important figure in the civil rights movement. She had a 5-decade career, largely as a behind-the-scenes organizer. And she really tried to get the civil rights movement to focus on at least two big things. One is to make sure that the movement wasn't all top down, but was also grassroots up. So making sure that ordinary Americans play a key role in promoting change when it comes to civil rights. The other big thing was to make sure that the civil rights movement wasn't just run by men, that to ensure that the civil rights movement also had important women leaders. But there are other key figures associated with this key group. One is Ralph Abernathy, who was a Baptist minister, a close friend and mentor to Dr. King. He worked with Dr. King on the Montgomery bus boycott, and he actually became the president of the organization after Dr. King's tragic assassination. There's also Fred Shuttlesworth, who was a minister from Birmingham and a close ally of Dr. King. And then finally, there's Bayard Rustin, who is this amazing both theoretician and just practical operator. He was an ally of A. Philip Randolph, the great African-American labor organizer. He was a trailblazer of nonviolent direct action. He taught those principles to Dr. King. And also, Rustin, though, also did really practical things. Like he organized the Freedom Ride. He organized the logistics around the March on Washington. He really was an extraordinarily interesting figure.
Yeah, unbelievably. And to think about it, moving nearly 1 million people into Washington, D.C. and out of Washington, D.C. in 24 hours, it's mind blowing. And without bloodshed, he just the strategy in his brain, kind of just blows me away. Okay, let's keep driving through these groups. So another major group is Congress for Racial Equality. And we have some leaders like Farmer in this one, amazing speakers, amazing leaders. And all these groups, how are they working together, Tom? And how are they kind of playing off of each other?
Yeah, so they have different emphases sometimes, but they're all, often working together on specific projects and also for the broader goal. So here we see Congress for Racial Equality, known as CORE. It's formed in 1942. It has a really broad and inspiring mission. It wanted to bring about, quote, equality for all people, regardless of race, creed, sex, age, disability, sexual orientation, religion, or ethnic background. It's another group inspired by Mahatma Gandhi's teachings of nonviolent resistance. Some of the key figures here are, as Curry already said, James Farmer, who was a major proponent of nonviolence and helped organize the first Freedom Rise. There's George Hauser, who was an important Methodist minister. And then there's Bernice Fisher, who was based in Chicago, and many people call the godmother of the sit-in movement.
Fantastic. Now, next we have another acronym. I'll have to put CORE on the one before it. Leadership Conference on Civil Rights.
Sure, they're also known as LCCR. They're actually still really active in the civil rights space today, which is true of some of these organizations we're talking about. It was founded in 1950. And really its big task, it coordinated big national legislative campaigns. So if we think of the big laws passed during the civil rights movement, like the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, LCCR is playing a key role in the strategy that's happening at the national level. Some of the key figures here are Roy Wilkins, who you see on the left, who's active from the 1930s all the way through to the 1970s. So a very long career. A. Philip Randolph, who was in the middle there, who's an important labor organizer within the civil rights movement. And then finally, Arnold Aronson, who is the executive secretary of LCCR from 1950 to 1980. He worked with Randolph to lobby FDR on civil rights, and he also helped to plan the March on Washington.
Next, we have Ella Baker coming in with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee.
Yeah, so also known as SNCC. And so this is really, when we get to SNCC, we're seeing really a transition in some of the figures who are in the civil rights movement. This is the part of the movement that's really, it's the young people. It's that next generation of civil rights leaders. But the connective tissue here, as Curry said, is Ella Baker. So we already talked about her with the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. She also plays a key role in establishing SNCC. And she tries to get this new organization to focus on really two big things. One is really still continue the push for nonviolent direct action, but also the other part was to push for voter registration and a real focus on voting rights. She would be a key mentor to each of these extraordinary figures we see on the screen: Diane Nash, John Lewis, Julian Bond, Stokely Carmichael, Bob Moses, and Bernice Johnson Reagan, all of them key figures in the civil rights movement in their own right, many going really having careers that expand, well beyond the formation of SNCC itself.
Now, a few other members that, I know we have so many people to get through today, but we didn't really get to talk enough in the last class around these three. So I just wanted to give us a moment because, I feel like we can't talk about civil rights if we don't talk about Fannie Lou Hamer. So I wanted to just give us a moment and pause on these three.
Yeah, so these are other key figures: Fannie Lou Hamer, Ruby Doris Smith Robinson, and Marion Barry. Again, all part of this generation in SNCC. Just taking Fannie Lou Hamer, for instance, she is a key figure in the push, especially for voting rights. She's one of the organizers of Mississippi Freedom Summer, which is a really important part as we're getting into the 1960s in the civil rights movement. But again, as you could just see from that, what is that? We talk about 9 different figures here, all famous, all important, all worthy of their own class, really, and all really representative of this younger generation of people entering the civil rights movement.
I know, I feel like we could literally just stop and only talk about Fannie Lou Hamer right now, or any other one of them, and go through and what they've lived through in their lives. Were so unbelievably tragic and still did so much to have good happen in our country. Another group, which people we could talk about for an entire week, the Committee for Equal Justice, and these two amazing human beings.
Of course, this is an organization that's founded by Rosa Parks and Recy Taylor. Rosa Parks, most famous for not giving up her seat on the bus in Montgomery, but she's a civil rights activist for many, many years. She was the secretary of the Montgomery chapter of the NAACP, a position she held for 14 years. And she worked with Recy Taylor, who was born in the Jim Crow South in Alabama, to form this organization, the Committee for Equal Justice. Their goal: to draw attention to discrimination, in particular against African-American women, and also the violence that African-American women often suffer.
Very, very important and something that we should all be reading and understanding more. Now, when we talk about all these different civil rights groups, we know that they were leaning on the president and Congress to make change. But another key player in this dialogue and the change that we see happening in our country is the Warren Court. They are a huge player in this as well. So I wanted to take a minute and just talk about the Warren Court. What is it? What did they do? And why are they seen very differently than other time periods of the court?
Yeah, sure. So the Warren Court, it's the Supreme Court that was led by Chief Justice Earl Warren and ran from 1953 to 1969. It's the court that, for instance, gave us Brown versus Board of Education, declaring school segregation unconstitutional. And it really was an ally of the civil rights movement in many ways. And this makes the Warren Court different than many of its predecessor courts. Through the vast bulk of constitutional history, the Supreme Court was no ally of civil rights. That changed with the Warren Court, with Chief Justice Warren and his colleagues. They carve out an important role for the Supreme Court in protecting minority rights, especially those of unpopular groups like African Americans, who often couldn't get a fair shake in the elected branches. They wanted to make sure that those groups, those people, receive the full protection and promise of our Constitution.
So when we think about, looking at court cases and going to the Supreme Court, going to the Warren Court during this time period, you need to be calling on the Constitution itself and other founding documents for where legitimacy is and where value is and how do we align with how we move things forward and change the Constitution to include those things. So let's do a little quick story walk through some of the documents that the civil rights teams use to tell the country, look, this is who we are, and this is how we need to be living up to our ideals. So I know you kicked off earlier with that Declaration of Independence, but where do we go from here? It's not just the Declaration, because that's not going to be the legal document you really want to take into the court.
Absolutely. But I mean, it is important to realize the Declaration of Independence, it's the beginning of America's story. It states America's creed, this famous quote that you see on the screen. It commits us to a nation founded on the promise of freedom and equality. And so these values, these principles are deeply written into our nation's DNA from the very beginning. And what we see from civil rights reformers over time is that they've used the Declaration of Independence and these founding principles of freedom and equality to hold a mirror up to America as it existed at different points in time, telling the rest of America to live fully up to these principles. And we'd see reformers doing this all the way from the beginning of American history, beginning in 1777 with a petition by Prince Hall, who was a free African American in Boston. He petitioned the Massachusetts legislature saying that you should abolish slavery in the state because it's inconsistent with the Declaration of Independence's promise of freedom and equality. Extending into the 1800s, we'd see key civil rights leaders like Frederick Douglass drawing again on the Declaration of Independence in his famous speech, "What to the Slave of the 4th of July," to challenge his white audience to live up to the words of our nation's founding creed and its promise of freedom and equality. And if you flash forward ahead another century, it continued all the way up into the March on Washington with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who described the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution in his "I Have a Dream" speech as a, quote, promissory note issued to all Americans regardless of race. So over time, Curry, one of the trends that we see are civil rights reformers drawing on the nation's founding principles, the best about America, to try to change America and get it to live up to its highest ideals.
And taking the principles and aligning it with the law and the action of the people, really locking it together. And, when we think about it and we talk about the Constitution, it begins with us. It begins with we. So what else is in the Constitution? You talked about the First Amendment already. Charlene shared in the chat how much did they use the Bill of Rights? And so how can we talk through the Constitution and other amendments to really support the work of the civil rights movement?
Absolutely. So, the civil rights movement, especially as it's beginning to, pick up steam in the 20th century, it's drawing a lot on the Constitution. Part of it's drawing on these words, the famous words we see on the screen here. We, the people, the preamble, the beginning of the Constitution. It's all the people, not just certain numbers of people, but all the people. Furthermore, we'd see civil rights reformers draw on other parts of the Constitution. As you said, Curry, part of this is drawing on key Bill of Rights protections, like free speech, assembly, petition. We see that throughout American history. Religious liberty, because we see religious groups play a key role in the civil rights movement throughout American history. But we also see the civil rights movement and reformers draw on the words written into the Constitution after the Civil War. The Reconstruction Amendments, our nation's second founding, with the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery, the 14th Amendment, ratified in 1868, which promised freedom and equality, and the 15th Amendment, ratified in 1870, banning racial discrimination in voting. The move here is to say, look, especially as we're dealing with Jim Crow segregation in the late 1800s and into the 1900s, is for civil rights advocates to say, look, Jim Crow laws are inconsistent with the Declaration of Independence and inconsistent with the Constitution. Look at the preamble. Look at the Reconstruction Amendments. These principles are on the side of the civil rights movement, not on the side of Jim Crow.
Unbelievable. And so we get to this Jim Crow era, and just for all of our students, what exactly is the Jim Crow era? Because if you have these huge amendments, you have the 13th Amendment, and let me get back to the right slide, 13th Amendment, it's 1865. And now we're going to talk about the civil rights movement really getting great traction in 1965. Yeah. So 100 years later, what is Jim Crow, and what happens in that 100 years to slow down the power that Congress had to make these changes stick?
Yeah, so we write these extraordinary and powerful promises into the Constitution, and for a period of time, a brief period, it works. And so we would see throughout the South multiracial democracy flourishing, with African Americans voting at massive numbers, African Americans holding office all the way from the United States Senate down to local justice of the peace. But as we got later and later into the 1890s and into the early 20th century, we'd see America turn away from the promise of the Reconstruction Amendments, pull away from multiracial democracy, and it would be replaced in the South with Jim Crow segregation. This was a mix of intimidation, violence, and laws on the books that basically put in place a sort of a pervasive system of racial discrimination. The core of it being things like segregation. So the idea that African Americans are going to have to ride in different train cars, sit in different parts of a bus, drink different water fountains, eat in different restaurants, stay in different hotels, attend different theaters. So it's this massive legal regime that ultimately also takes away the vote at the ballot box. And what we see is the Supreme Court, unlike the Warren Court, the Supreme Court in the 1890s and in 1896 in a case called Plessy versus Ferguson, looks at this system of Jim Crow segregation and says, you know what? It is constitutional. It is consistent with our Constitution. Separate but equal is okay. You can have separate facilities for African Americans and white Americans as long as they're equal. And so you see the Supreme Court green light the system of Jim Crow. Now, it was a 7-1 ruling, Plessy was. So it wasn't unanimous. There was a single dissenting voice on the court, but it was a powerful voice. Justice John Marshall Harlan, who basically said what we're probably all thinking right now, which is, Supreme Court, what in the world are you talking about? In what way is Jim Crow segregation consistent with the 14th Amendment's promise of equality? And so what Justice John Marshall Harlan says is our Constitution's colorblind. There is no caste here. In the United States, all are equal. And his prediction was that future generations would look at Plessy versus Ferguson as one of the great mistakes in American constitutional history. And he was absolutely right.
Awesome. Now we're going to dive into all these constitutional changes and the Supreme Court like shutting down the power that's in the Reconstruction Amendments at this time. And now we're going to look at people don't give up. African Americans do not give up. They create along with all those groups, an unbelievable strategy to move and change the law. But I wanted to just add in part of Mackenzie's question, because Mackenzie, you got a two-parter there, and it's a fantastic question. Part one is really about what is the civil rights movement all about? Is it just about equal rights under the law, or is it more than that? And it kind of goes with what Marshall says. I mean, John Marshall Harlan says that we have no caste system. It's not just about equal rights under the law. It's about economic freedom. It's about civil rights. It's about education rights. So we see all these pieces working together. So kind of as we go through these stories, help us understand what are all the aspects that they're fighting for. When you listen to MLK and you listen to Malcolm X, it is way more than just civil rights. And we really need to unpack that. But then the second question is, from this great class that's in here, is this today, if we look back, was it unsuccessful? And then what are the actions that we need to take today? So I love the way your class is thinking there. And Tom, laying it all on you as we dump into the legal strategy of the NAACP.
Yeah, those are great framing questions to have in mind as we get. So we're going to walk through two different parts of the civil rights movement here in the 1950s and 60s. First, we're going to look at the story inside the Supreme Court, and then we're going to talk about everything that's happening outside of the Supreme Court. So beginning inside the Supreme Court, the key group to know here is the NAACP. And so they end up, these are key figures like you see on the left there, Thurgood Marshall. His teachers, Charles Hamilton Houston and William Hastie. They organize this brilliant legal strategy to ultimately hope to overturn Plessy v. Ferguson and really pull up Jim Crow segregation, Jim Crow laws from the roots up. They want to just pull the roots out of the ground. And they realize this is going to take time. Legal change takes time inside the courts. And so they build a legal strategy over time to chip away at Plessy v. Ferguson, undermine some of its constitutional foundations in case after case in different contexts until finally in Brown versus Board of Education in 1954, they can go for the really big prize. And that's attacking Jim Crow school segregation. This story arises from, in part, Linda Brown. This person you see on the screen here, this third grader, what did she want? Well, she just wanted to go to her local public school in Kansas. But the Board of Education said, no, Linda Brown, you're not welcome here. This is a school only for white students. So Linda Brown and her family brought her case. It eventually finds its way to the Supreme Court with some other cases throughout the nation. And in the end, what does the Warren Court say in response to Linda Brown's constitutional arguments? Linda Brown, you are right. We, the Supreme Court, we were wrong. We've been wrong for a really, really long time. Plessy v. Ferguson was wrong the day it was decided. And so the Supreme Court in Brown unanimously, it's a unanimous vote, overturns Plessy v. Ferguson. And it concludes that school segregation violates the 14th Amendment's promise of equal protection of the laws. And here's the key quote from Chief Justice Warren. We conclude that in the field of public education, the doctrine of separate but equal has no place. Separate educational facilities are inherently unequal. There's no way to make them equal. They brand African Americans with a badge of inferiority, and they are unconstitutional, inconsistent with the 14th Amendment.
Unbelievable. And as we kind of jump into this and we think about this work, you know, it's 1954, you have separate is not equal. And the conversation that we literally could spend, and we did when we taught this class at Penn, spent an entire day talking about Brown 1 and Brown 2 and looking at school segregation, because schools are now more segregated than they were in the 1980s. And so what does that mean? What the questions around busing, the cases around busing. So there's so much to unpack here. And I really do suggest reading the opinions in the cases. They're unbelievably powerful, and they're really fascinating about the language they use in all deliberate speed, but at the same time need to get this to happen, and with understanding of school systems are very tricky. But there's also students who fight for this. There's Linda Brown, but there's also, you know, when I look at this picture and I look at these students who are fighting to walk to class, just walk to class, we need to think about how in the 1950s, the students and the courts and the civil rights leadership use different parts of the government to back this movement and this change for educational freedom, to go where your local school goes. And that's the establishment of public schools. So talk a little bit about the Little Rock Nine and how the executive branch stepped in.
Yeah, again, you're right, Corey. Again, it's young people. It's these courageous young people. It's 1957. So we have Brown versus Board of Education. In response, we see what is often called massive resistance to Brown in the South, among political leaders, among ordinary Americans. And so it's going to take more work to practically carry out Brown on the ground to make sure that we really do desegregate our schools. A key crisis point is in 1957. It's in Little Rock, Arkansas. It involves 9 African-American students, the Little Rock Nine. They attempt to enroll at the all-white Central High School, and they're greeted by the governor, Orville Faubus, who calls out the National Guard to block them, and with the support of white mobs. And ultimately, it's going to take, in part, the efforts of the national government coming in to enforce Brown versus Board of Education to get those forces to step aside. It's President Eisenhower who sends in 1,000 federal troops and nationalizes the Arkansas National Guard to protect the African-American students. In a powerful speech, President Eisenhower explains his decision to the nation. And then finally, it's the Warren Court that steps in again to reinforce the president's actions in a case called Cooper versus Aaron in 1958. And effectively what the court says there is state officers and governors, you have a duty to obey the orders of the Supreme Court, even if you don't like them.
Now, when we're talking about students, we start with Linda Brown, we look at the Little Rock Nine, and it is violent. We're going to show a lot of images over the next few of children stepping up in the face of violence. And that leads us to 1955. 54 is the image, 55 is what happened to Emmett Till. So Emmett Till was killed in 55. And Tom, we talked about this in the last class. Tell us a little bit about the Emmett Till story and how this moment in time is a flashpoint to get the whole country to start paying attention to the violence that people, African Americans, had lived under for hundreds of years across the country, not just in the South.
Yeah, so Emmett Till, he's a 14-year-old. He's visiting a town in Mississippi, and he's accused of offending a white woman in her family's grocery store. He's abducted, he's tortured, he's murdered, and he's sort of left in a river. His body emerges, and after this tragedy, his mother makes a really difficult decision. She says she gets the body sent back to Chicago, and in the end, she has an open casket funeral to make everyone see the gruesome murder that happened, as really a symbol of more widespread violence that we've seen over time against African Americans. And in a certain sense, it's a key moment that awakens the national conscience, and it really exposes many Americans who hadn't really had to face it face to face, the evil of this system of racial segregation that we saw.
And we do always like to think about the unbelievable power that it took his mother to be able to do that. 50,000 people viewed Emmett Till during his funeral service. 100 days later, a woman that we talked about earlier was getting on a bus and she got really nervous and she said to herself in her head, "Do it for Emmett." So this sparks not only a country to pay attention to the violence, but also sparks people who have been fighting for decades to continue to push that fight because of what happened to a little boy that they didn't know.
Yeah, that's a great transition, Curry. And yeah, let's walk through some of the big things that happened in these years in the late 1950s and early 1960s. So, in 1955, we see this famous image of Rosa Parks, who's a civil rights activist in Montgomery, Alabama. She refuses to give up her bus seat, in Montgomery. She's ultimately arrested for violating the law, but she's acting as part of a broader strategy in the civil rights movement. In response, we see a massive bus boycott throughout Montgomery, and it's not a single moment. It's a bus boycott that lasts for over a year to push against segregation in Montgomery, Alabama. And in the end, you think that's an amazing amount of inconvenience for so many people in the African-American community. You have to walk to work, walk to school, but in the end, they fight hard and they fight for change in Montgomery. We then see, as we flash forward ahead to 1960, the beginning of the student-led sit-in movement in Greensboro, North Carolina. The movement spreads eventually to Nashville, Atlanta, other major cities. This is really a key example of nonviolent direct action. So as part of a sit-in, student activists, and again, these are really, really courageous young people. They'd enter a segregated public place, like a grocery counter, which you see in the picture here, and sit in the whites only area. They'd often be surrounded by mobs who would threaten them, who would harass them, who would physically assault them. And in response to this violence, the activists would respond with nonviolence, again, to expose the sort of force that it takes to uphold unjust Jim Crow laws. Flash forwarding ahead to 1961, we see another key flashpoint in the civil rights movement, another push led by the Congress Racial Justice. It begins the Freedom Rides. And so then these are activists in the North driving down on buses, interstate down into southern states. Their goal is to desegregate buses and bus terminals. But again, this takes an amazing amount of physical courage because they know that their activism is going to be met with really stunning violence. They're beaten. Some of their buses are bombed. And many of these images end up in newspapers, in national media, and end up, again, awakening the national conscience to some of the evils that are existing in these Jim Crow systems. And then finally, we flash forward ahead to 1963, where we have two huge events. One of them is a protest in Birmingham, Alabama, the Children's March of 1963, which is, in many ways, it's a massive protest. And so we have, many civil rights, activists, but also children marching and protesting racial discrimination in Birmingham. In response, Bull Connor, who's the city's police commissioner, orders the city's police force to respond with violence. And so we see things like snarling dogs, cattle prods, high-pressure fire hoses, dispersing the civil rights protesters. This violence is caught on television cameras, beamed into the evening news throughout the United States, again, helping to reshape public opinion around civil rights. We see, in response to these activities in Birmingham, Dr. King is arrested. And so while arrested, Martin Luther King Jr. writes one of the great tracts in American political history known as A Letter from a Birmingham Jail. I wish we could spend a lot of time on it here. I just urge you, it's not terribly long. Read it. It's an amazingly profound work of philosophy, of political thought, of political theory, of constitutional theory. And it's one of the great tracts in American history. And then finally, we see in August 1963, civil rights supporters meet for the famous March on Washington. They're meeting, it's the 100th anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation. It attracts hundreds of thousands of people into Washington, D.C. to the Lincoln Memorial. And Martin Luther King Jr. emerges in many ways as the public face of this event with his I Have a Dream speech. But again, the March on Washington, this image alone reminds you, well, Dr. King, he's such an important figure. He's such an important synthesizer of so many of the powerful arguments being made by the civil rights movement. But in the end, the push for civil rights requires both leaders like him, but also the grassroots and everyone pushing for change.
Unbelievable. Thank you, Tom. And that was a fantastic job kind of moving everything forward as we wrap up in the last few minutes. And then we also see that you get this significant change when you also have the Civil Rights Act being put through, the signing of the Civil Rights Act in 1964. And then violence again ensues in our country. One of the key moments here is Bloody Sunday in Selma, Alabama. And there's John Lewis right there, sporting a backpack, which was not normal at the time. And he's like 25 years old. And then also the Voting Rights Act of 1965. But our students posed that question early on, does the civil rights movement have impact, or was it, as another student said, null and void? And I'd like for us to kind of hold like a little dilemma thinking here. Could it still be impactful and had great significant change, but at the same time, maybe not be done? Or maybe another wave must come. So I wonder if we can look at those two things together and analyze almost any area that we've gone over today: education, freedom of where you're able to work, where you're able to drive, where you're able to live, where you're able to go to school, where you're able to vote, and what are those questions that we still have around that today? So any final words as I'm making everybody do dilemma thinking. We can't get rid of one, we hold everything together. Amazing, amazing work of these human beings, and more yet to need it.
I can't do better than that, Curry. That was wonderful.
Oh, thanks. I love this topic. I think I cried twice today. And I did not know that the March on Washington was the 100-year anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation. I mean, I knew the number, but I never realized that was the reason. So thank you so much, Tom. I always learn so much from you. Students, thank you so much for sharing everything and your ideas and your thoughts with each other and your great questions. And if you have any more questions, we'll hold up after this. But thank you all so much. Have a great day. And Hassan Jeffries is going to join us for a lecture on Friday at 1 o'clock, both in the building and virtually online. So if you want to sign up for that, I can send that out to you as well. Thank you all.
Thanks, everyone.
Okay, officially stop the recording and let's see if I have questions. Thank you, David. You're always so nice to us. Happy New Year to you too. Thank you, Cadet. That's awesome. We have really smart people in today's class. I loved all the thinking going on in the chat. Good. Jermaine, that's a good share. We have really good, everybody was sharing really good other people and other moments to look into.
That's awesome.
I know, again, we'll make this PowerPoint 80 slides. Well, it's actually, let me tell you right now, people, the PowerPoint is already 100 slides. We only show a few. So if you go into the PowerPoint, there's a million things in there. But I will tell you, Jermaine, I don't have the June 1964, the killings of Cheney, Goodman, and Schweiner is the three
that's a good
voting
one to have
rights.
in there for sure.
Yeah,
that's so important.
Also, the four little girls at the Birmingham, like there's just so this would literally be the 8. This is why so many great books are written on it. Which
we never get to bring up Medgar Evers. I mean, like there's just so much that we can.
I know. Jimmy Lee Jackson, like so many. We don't even get to talk about Selma, and I can spend an hour talking about Selma's one day. And let me see if there's any. Nicole, that was a great thought that you had there. I really appreciate it. Oh, the DC fires and the LA fires. They were 2 other things that everybody wanted to make sure we were all sharing. And Mary, yes, good point. Rosa was not the first to do the bus. What's the case in 1954? Is it Morgan? The federal.
I can't remember off the top of my head, but yeah.
Yeah, that's a interstate bus system, and it was Morgan who sat on that bus.
Boynton?
Okay, we're gonna have to. We'll send it out to all of you at the end of this. I swear to God, I changed the name and then make myself believe it's right.
You might be right, though. Yeah.
Oh, I don't know. I'm not trustworthy with names of things. That is not my strong suit. Awesome. I think we were all sharing like what areas the civil rights movement today. Okay, cool. I think we're good with questions unless I miss one, people, but thank you so much.
Right. Thanks, everyone.
Feel better, Tom.
Thank you.
Or at least
it held better. Up, though. I mean, it's not quite as robust as usual, but I held up okay.
Awesome. Thank you very much. Have a good one, everybody.